Okay, right, let's make a start. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Sheffield Chamber's latest business support webinar, creating a knockout communications plan. Just want to start with some housekeeping. Just want to remind everybody that this morning's session is being recorded, and it will be uploaded to Sheffield Chamber's YouTube channel shortly after the event. If you haven't already done so, please could you just mute your microphones if you're not speaking, just to alleviate any background noise for the speakers. Thank you very much. We'll have some time for questions at the end. Just onto today's webinar, creating a knockout communications plan. It's obviously more important than ever to ensure that your communications and your messaging, your marketing cuts through the noise. Which is why we've partnered with Counter Context to deliver this webinar this morning. Counter Context are a communications and PR consultancy with offices in Sheffield, London and Manchester. Last year, Counter Context were named top PR agency in South Yorkshire by media site Prolific North, and they were also ranked 17th in the list of top 50 PR agencies in the North. I'm delighted to be joined by Jane Witham, who is PR Account Director, and Sharon Robson, who is Account Manager at Counter Context, who will be delivering this morning's session. The workshop will last approximately 40 minutes, and then there will be some time at the end for questions, which can be submitted throughout via the chat box, or you can wait till the end and raise your virtual hand. But just to tell us a little bit more about Counter Context, introduce themselves, and to deliver this morning's session, it's a pleasure to hand over to Jane. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Sam. Morning, everybody. Hope you're all well today. Just a few introductions to start with, myself and Sharon, a little bit about Counter Context, and then we'll get into the presentation itself. So a little bit about me. I'm a qualified journalist. I've worked in PR and media since the early 1990s in lots of different sectors over that career. And I ran for 6 years a PR agency based in Barnsley and in Leeds. We worked with 100 SMEs during that time, so I'm quite familiar with the challenges of running smaller businesses and organisations, and how it can be quite difficult sometimes to turn your hand to comms and PR when you're busy running a business day to day. I've worked on all manner of PR projects with all manner of companies. Just a few examples. I launched an international space programme funded by cryptocurrency at the World Economic Forum about 3 or 4 years ago, which is as mind-blowing as it sounds. I also supported Professor Alexis Jay when she did her investigation into child sexual exploitation in Rotherham and helped publish that report, and gathered the media coverage that it rightly deserved. And I've also even worked with one of the Europe's largest importers of koi carp, really random kind of extremes within PR, but the principles are the same. If you apply the basic principles and apply them well, then any client you can follow that formula with. So that's a little bit about me. Sharon, if you want to fill us in.
Thanks, Jane. Good morning, everybody. I'm Sharon Robson. I quite recently joined Counter Context as an account manager. Previously to this, I was working for South Yorkshire Passenger Transport Executive as a digital marketing officer for 2.5 years. But before that, primarily I've worked as a regional reporter for the Ministry of Defence. I covered all the Army and Royal Air Force operations and locations that were happening in the east of England. I was based in Colchester, so I predominantly worked with the Parachute Regiment and 16 Air Assault Brigade during what was some very busy times on Op Herrick. I relocated to Sheffield, and I did join an agency as a relationship manager, which is a very fast way to find out what it's like to go from being a journalist to working on the other side of the desk. Outside of working hours, I'm also a comms and social media volunteer for victim support in South Yorkshire.
Okay, so a little bit about Counter Context. as Sam explained, we're a specialist PR and communications consultancy, and we work primarily in the energy, utilities, place, regeneration and transport fields. But we work through that whole supply chain. Before the pandemic, we had offices in London and in Manchester and in Sheffield where we're headquartered, but now we've got 25 offices in the UK. And we've actually got one in Spain because we've got a director who's based in Spain. Our services include the typical services that you'd get within a PR agency, such as PR and crisis management and design, but we also offer statutory consultations, public consultations, high-level public affairs, crisis management, and we work on some projects that have quite a long lifespan, maybe 2, 3, 4 years even. And clients include companies like the ones on the right-hand side, clients that you may be familiar with locally. We're working with Sheffield City Council on the communications for the Heart of the City development, which is the 470 million regeneration of Sheffield City Centre. And we've worked with the council and the developers over a number of years to make sure the messaging on that project's right, to ensure that stakeholders are engaged and that people are listened to, and that's reflected in the ongoing sort of design and consultation. We're also working with Ørsted, who are developing the world's largest offshore wind farm in the North Sea, and we've been working on a PR basis and on a consultation basis with a company called Hive Energy, who have just had consent from the government for the UK's largest solar farm in Kent. So some really transformational projects which are really kind of making a difference to the carbon footprint in the UK and what we're going to look like as a country going forwards. So that's a little bit about Counter Context and our experience. Okay, so what we'll cover today, we'll look at why you actually need a plan and what those objectives are that are going into a plan. You need to be really, really clear on what your objectives are and what you're hoping to achieve. We'll look at who your audiences are, and you may be surprised to learn that you've got a lot more audiences than you think. It's not always the obvious who you need to be talking to or communicating with. We'll be looking at messages and how you formulate messages and how you get that cut through with your messages so they really resonate with those audiences. And we'll be looking at tactics, some of the ways that you can use your messaging to cut through, some of the newer ways of communicating and some of the more established ways which still are still pretty effective. And we'll also then look at monitoring and evaluating, which is equally important, because if you don't know where you've departed from, what your departure point is, then you don't know what your destination is and you don't know how you've got there and you can't monitor and evaluate. So that's what we'll be looking at today, but we'll run through the slides and hopefully it'll all become a little bit clearer. Okay, so why do you need a communications plan? If you don't have a map, you don't know where you're going. You don't know where you are, you don't know what your destination is, you don't know whether you'll get there. You may get there, you may just get lucky. But you know, 9 times out of 10, you'll take detours, which might be costly, they might cost you time, they might cost you reputation. So you need to be really, really clear on where you're going. If you're directionless, where you end up is anyone's guess. And plans, for me, they'll give you direction, but they also give you consistency. And they mean that if you do something well, you know what you've done and you can repeat it and ensure that you do it again. Similarly, if you do something wrong, that you know not to do it again. And you can only measure, like I said before, if you know actually where you've come from and where you're going. So for me, good communication is organised communication. And the more organised you can be at the outset in being very, very clear who you're talking to and what you're saying, and what your ambition is and what your goals are, then the clearer your communication will be. And it's very much a case of start as you mean to go on. Start with clarity and you'll end up with clear messages and clear outcomes. But if you start off in a confused manner with different destinations and different ideas, then you know you very quickly your communications will be an almighty tangle. If you think about planning communications, if you've ever received a really badly written email that's been written in a hurried way, or it's confused, or it's got mixed messages, or it's in shouty capitals, it leaves a bad impression. And it's not the kind of impression that you want to be leaving for your customers and clients. So for me, planning at every stage is absolutely imperative, because when you are communicating, you are making an impression on clients or on customers or on staff or on whoever it might be that's at the other end of that communications. So take the time at the beginning to make a communications plan.
Right. Thanks, Jane. So we thought a good place to start would be to think about your objectives. What is it that you want to achieve? And prioritise what the most important are to you as an organisation, as a business, as a person. Examples of those objectives are build trust, manage expectations, increase awareness, explain the differences. What do you do different to your competitors maybe? And the values, explain the values of your organisation. You might want to be educating customers, or you might want to solve problems. Equally, you might want to be attracting and retaining staff. You might have an employment drive. You might want to expand into a particular sector, recruit people in a specific geographic area maybe. It's really important to be clear on these objectives. When you're clear on what the objective is, it keeps things focused for you, and it avoids dilution when you come to kind of putting together your communications plan. The next point that is important is to define your audience. Again, this takes some real thinking about, because different audiences need to receive different messages, and how you approach it can be quite individual. So second examples here of audiences are new and existing customers, employees, so might be doing internal newsletters, particularly at the moment when people are working from home, things like that are really important. Stakeholders, you might need to be getting some stakeholders on board with something that you want to do in the near future. But then also, importantly, you've got media and influencers. Defining your audience is really crucial, because you want to connect with that audience at a real emotional level. And you can only do this really when you're focused on who your audience is. A lot of people use audience personas for something like this, because that can help bring focus on who you're pitching to and who you think that your audience ultimately is.
Okay, so what do your audience need to know? Well, first of all, they need to know they can trust you, and that's absolutely imperative. Forget about everything else, because trust is the absolute most important thing. Then after you've developed the trust, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a moment, they need to know who you are. It's really basic. Who are you? What do you do? What problems can you solve for them? And are you trusted by others? Which is really, really important. Trust is so important at every level, and with every audience. If you think about breaking that down a little, your employees, they need to know that they can trust you. They're advocating for your business. They need to know that your business and you are trustworthy. Similarly, it works both ways. Your customers need to know that they can trust you, because if they don't trust you, there'll be no sales. They won't buy from you. They won't be interested in you. They'll go to your competitors. Any sort of stakeholders or investors, they need to know they can trust you. Otherwise, they're not going to part with their cash. They're not going to back you. And journalists and influencers and organisations are not going to advocate for you again if they don't trust you, because by advocating for you, they're endorsing you. And if they can't trust you, they won't endorse you. So trust is absolutely pivotal at every level of communication. So how do you go about building trust? What you need to do is to communicate the very basics. So who you are, you need to tell people who you are and what you do. And it's really, really simple. You can see a lot of businesses going into great detail about who they are and what they do, and they actually lose the point. And the point is that less is more. Who are you? What do you do? And what problems can you solve? I might not need to know about all your services. I might need to know about what you can do for me, what the problem is that you can solve for me. And a really, really important aspect, and it's increasing all the time, is, are you trusted by others? Because if others have already taken a punt on you and they've decided that you're trustworthy, then it makes it so much easier for other people to then trust you. If you think about Trustpilot or TripAdvisor, it's so much easier to choose a restaurant to go and visit if it's got 5-star reviews or it's got good reviews underneath. Similarly, you might avoid somewhere that's only got 1 or 2 stars. And it actually is so important that we kind of follow the trust of others, and increasingly so, more so than ever. So yeah, your audience needs to know that they can trust you. You can begin to sort of build your own trust through clear communication, but by doing what you say you're going to do, by being true to your values. And if you can seek out testimonials, you can seek out reviews, then that will help build that trust, but ultimately you'll be judged by your own actions. One particularly good way using communications to build trust is through identifying prestigious awards and high-level awards, and submitting submissions for those. And if you're lucky enough to win them, then that's a third-party endorsement, and that means that you've got if they're run by a chartered industry, or they're run by the chamber, or they're run by something that's independently verified, then it means that you're getting that recognition and that validation from a third party, which passes then to your business. You're passing that trust through the business. So there are lots of different ways you can build trust, but ultimately it's by your own behaviour and your own actions. And that is magnified and echoed through your communications. So if you do the right thing and you communicate that clearly, and you gain the trust of others, then you can begin to build that momentum of trust and move forward as a business.
Okay, moving on now to messages and message preparation. It's important at this point to return to a company mission statement that you might have, and your values and your vision, because these will form part of the messages that you want to share with your prospective audience. Think about what words you want to associate with your company, your brand, your product, or you as a person. Consider what makes you different. What are your key features as a business? Review your competitors' key messages to ensure that yours are different, or that yours are better, will stand apart from what they're saying. And similar to what James was saying, substantiate this with statistics, with accolades, with awards, with testimonials, and back it up. It's one thing to sort of say it, but if you've got something to really back it up, it does stand apart. So aligning your messages with your business objectives as well, it keeps your audience in mind as you're going along. Always do keep your audience in mind, because again, it's a specific audience that you might want to talk to at different times of when you're making a communications plan. And again, going back to just reinforcing that point of trust, which we've talked about a little bit, but it is really important to focus on. So digging down a little bit more into the messaging part of a comms plan, aim for 4 or 5 key messages. Anything more than that could make it more complicated for you, particularly if this is something new or something that you haven't visited for a long time. So try and keep it simple. Each statement only 1 sentence long. Define and differentiate yourself again against competitors. Equally, again, keep your audience in mind. Make your message really relevant to them and tailor it. You don't want to have a message that might only speak to one part of your audience if you're wanting to sort of spread something a little bit wider. An important thing, again, to look at is the so what test. So, you can always run this past other people in your life. tell them a statement, and if the result is so what, then you might need to go back and review that message a little bit. Simple English is something to keep in mind as well. Don't use acronyms. Don't assume that everybody knows what an acronym might be. Or, the military was really bad for that. Something I learned moving from working with the military to going into private sector was that not everybody will get what those acronyms are. And be subtle as well. Don't use the message to overtly sell. You're educating people. Communications is not a hard sell. That's where marketing maybe comes more into the picture, but we'll get onto that too much today. Again, going back to trust, this is what you're really aiming to do, to make the audience trust you. You don't want to risk potentially alienating prospective customers.
Okay, so there's quite a simple formula for developing messages, and at the end of this presentation, Sam's going to send out to you a template for a communications plan, which will really help you map it out and cover all this off again. But there's a really simple way to develop messages. When you're looking at your messages and you've got so much to say and so much to tell people, it can be quite hard to pick through what's the important bit. But what you should aim to do, 4 or 5 key messages, and then you can develop out the message a little bit, and then you can add some evidence in. So I've used an example of Sheffield Chamber just to kind of bring this to life. So your key message might be something around the Chamber's help businesses in the Sheffield region grow and connect. But you might have the opportunity to build that out a little bit. You may be an opinion piece you're writing, it might be a newsletter, you just might have a little bit more space to put a little bit more meat on the bones. So you build that message out saying it's a membership organisation, and you maybe mention some of the services and who those services are for, so the business community. And if you really wanted to underline that message, what you need to do is evidence it and add some proof in. So if there are any stats to back that up, so it would be, together the Chamber represents tens of thousands of businesses of all shapes and sizes when combined with the British Chambers of Commerce, and those businesses employ almost 6 million people. So you're giving your key message validity by using a statistic. And that formula can be applied to any message. You start off with the basics, you put in a sub message to build it out a little bit, you underline it with proof, and it's a really effective way of getting your message across. And if you replicate that 4 or 5 times with the key points of your business, you'll have your message framework, which you can then use as almost the bricks and mortar for your communications plan and for all your communications going forward. So it's as simple as that. Okay, so when you've got your objectives, you've got your audience, you've got your messages, you might start to think about, how do I get those messages out? What channels am I going to use? And the temptation is to spam out your message everywhere because there are so many different channels. And that's never a good idea, because what you'll just end up doing is diluting your message. You need to pick the channels that are most appropriate to your audience, and if you're clear with your audience and who they are, then you can be clear what your channels are. So not all channels are appropriate. It may be that you're particularly communicating to an older demographic who particularly aren't online, if you work in in a charity or Age UK or something like that. So you may need to take a different approach to your communication. It might need to be written, it might need to be posted, it might need to be put into a magazine and distributed that way. It might be that you're dealing with younger people and you're particularly looking at social media channels which are relevant. Discount Facebook because it's for people of a certain age now, but it's all about TikTok. So you choose your channel to suit your audience, and keep an open mind on what might work for you. There's no particular recipe for success. Sometimes we have to just try different things, and some things will work and some things won't. But there's a few examples there of the options that might be open to you, and you might be doing some of them anyway. But again, for me, less is always more with communications. If you can do 1 or 2 things really, really well, it's much, much better than doing all these things and just doing it maybe 10% of your capability. So have a look at what you're doing, review what you're doing, ask yourself whether it's working for you, whether it's effective, and if it isn't, then perhaps try a few different things. there's there's different ways to do it. Some will have a cost implication, some are free, some it's about time, but we'll come on to budgets in a little bit more detail in a moment. But yeah, ask your audience where they get their news. If you're in contact with those customers or those stakeholders, ask them, how do you receive your news? What news channels do you tune into? Do you read the Star Business section? Do you read Unlimited magazine? What are you reading? Who are you following on LinkedIn? And when you can start to gain an understanding of your audience and how they think, then you can think a little bit like them when it comes to sending out your information and sharing that information with them in an attempt to sort of influence them and educate them. So a quick recap of what we've covered so far. We've looked at why you need a plan, because if you don't have a plan, you don't have a map, you don't have a destination. What your objectives will be and what you need to do to align your objectives of your communication to your wider objectives of your business plan. You need to define an audience and look at what they need to know. They need to know about you, they need to know they can trust you, they need to know what you do, and they need to know that others trust you. We've looked at how you build a message using the 3-part message system, how you develop that key message, how you can build it out, and then you can add in evidence to really underline your point. And we've looked at some of the channels that are available to you. And next we'll have a look at spokespeople, how you can use people within your organisation or your business to the best effect. How frequently you should be talking to your audiences, budgets, and how much you need to be perhaps allocating. And again, finally, how to evaluate the success of what you've done and how to tweak it to make it better next time.
Right, so on to, as Jane said, we talk about spokespeople and how often you will communicate, you plan to communicate with your audiences. It's really important here to think about who will be your spokesperson and consider this very carefully, because this person could be conducting interviews on radio, on television, be that pre-record or live, and they are going to be the face and the voice of your business. I think it's worth considering here as well that it doesn't always have to be the most senior person, it doesn't have to be the CEO. You can mix it up, engage and integrate your values with different audiences by using different people. So if you're a youth organisation, for example, empower your younger members in your workforce or in your charity or whatever your business is. If you're in a sector or business that might be underrepresented by women, consider having a female spokesperson. Equally, and this is quite key, if you're offering a spokesperson as a subject matter expert, make sure that they are, because Jane and I could probably tell you from experience, journalists can be quite tricky sometimes, and if the person isn't an expert, they'll potentially uncover that. And again, that goes back to building trust. And it's the same for, if you've got to quote somebody, if you've got a sign off, an approval process, think about that. If you're working in a comms department but you want a sign-off quote from a CEO, you've got to think about that in a timely way. Sometimes things like that can take a little bit of time. And finally, how often are you going to communicate with your audience? Don't overdo it. There's probably a temptation to really get lots of information out there and rush, and particularly if you're excited about something new that might be happening, but less is often more. And by taking time, it's also easier then when you go back to review your comms plan and how it worked. When you've kind of taken your time over it, it's easier to review how it went. On to budget, probably quite an important, prevalent subject. This is probably about considering what other costs you could incur. Having really big plans of things that you want to do is great, and if your budget supports extra stuff, then great. But actually, comms isn't always, if you've got a younger company, isn't always something you can put much budget aside for. So consider things like design costs, print costs, if you're going to be sending out a leaflet drop, software licenses. You may have some great in-house experience with people, but software licenses for things can become, can be quite costly. Particularly if you're looking at things like video content, stuff for social media. Obviously, at the moment, anything virtual and online based is really important while we're all at home. But a really important thing to consider is your time, the company's time, because that does have a cost, and particularly if you're a smaller business, if you're an SME or you're a self-employed person, your time's really, really precious. So consider how much time you're putting into a comms plan.
Okay, so we'll look next at measurement and evaluation, and how you can really know if what you're doing, if your activity is actually effective. Going right back to the beginning and the map analogy, you can only know how far you've come if you know what your starting point is, and you can only measure if you've got a starting point as well. If you don't know, if you don't know where you are on the map, then you're not going to be able to evaluate, you're not going to be able to make changes, you're not even going to be able to improve your activity. So, what might you want to look at? You may want to look at brand awareness. You might want to look at your return on investment. You might want to look at whether it's generating any leads for you, whether it's increasing turnover, or if you're a charity, whether it's increasing donations or volunteer hours. Be very, very clear about what your objectives are and what you want to measure. And then what you really need to make sure you do is you select the KPI that's aligned to your goals. And again, if you have a very clear reporting structure, you can see how effective it's been. And I've come across so many people over the years who very enthusiastically get involved with communications but don't measure. And if you don't measure, then you can never begin to improve. You don't really, you have no idea on how you're doing. So it can feel quite a cumbersome thing to do at the end of a project, but it is as vital as it is as actually making the plan in the first place. It's the bookend. So yeah, you might want to look at measuring brand awareness. You might want to look at measuring your media coverage. Or your web traffic. If you're looking to particularly build reputation and profile, and you're undertaking media relations, then subscribe to Google alerts and get some information through about when your name or your company name is in the media. Again, you can study your web traffic if you're driving particular traffic to your website as part of a brand awareness campaign. You might want to look at which pages people are touching down on. If one of your channels is social media, you may want to look at not just visitor numbers, but your engagement levels and how many people are actually engaging with your content, and begin to see and evaluate whether you're creating a buzz, if that's what your objective is. If you're more sales orientated and your objectives are more sales orientated, and you've gone down the kind of newsletter line, online newsletter, you might want to look at subscribers or click-throughs and begin to build a picture of how effective that's been. Try split testing, try different approaches to your email marketing, if that's the method that you choose. There are so many analytics available now, free analytics attached to everything from Google, Twitter, LinkedIn. LinkedIn's a bit dodgy and not the easiest to use, but it does have a lot of information and data in there that'll begin to sort of help you begin to understand how effective your communications are being. So using data, as I said, data is absolutely everywhere at the moment, and it can be quite easy to get bogged down in data. If you dive into Google Analytics, and I've just disappeared in it for hours at a time, and it becomes quite engaging when you realise that you're attracting visitors from Rwanda and things like that. It's kind of, how did that happen? But if you stick to the basics and you stick to the top line figures and levels, then you'll be able to see how your web traffic is being influenced by your activity. And if you can draw correlations between, so say you put out a media release and it gets coverage, and you know there's been coverage, and then you see a spike onto your news page or onto your inquiries page, or you recruit for a job and you advertise and suddenly your careers page on your website's getting a lot of traffic, you can draw correlations between the two. You can see which social media platforms are sending you traffic, and you can use that data then to inform your strategy. So you do more of the stuff that's working and do less of the stuff that's not having any effect for you. But be strict when you're diving into the data, and don't get distracted, and try and very much use that data to further improve what you're already doing. Sometimes it's experimental, it's getting the right mixes down to trial and error with data. You might dive into things and find that they don't offer the level of data, or it's too granular, or you have to pay additional amounts of money to get that kind of deep data. But there is a lot of free data out there, and if you can begin to build that into a process of housekeeping around your communications, then it'll serve you well. Okay. So to recap, what we've covered why you need a plan, what your objectives are, who your audiences are, what your messages are, the tactics and the channels you're using, and monitoring and evaluation. And I think with all these, following this process, and it's a very clear process, if you can break it down and take each part separately and keep it clear, and remember that less is more, then you'll have the basis for a very, very good communications plan. But a comms plan will only be as good as the foundations that it's laid on. And that's about planning, it's about understanding, and you need to take, rather than just diving into it, you need to actually take some space and take some time out, step back from your job and your business and your other demands on your time to take an overview of what are my objectives, what are the business objectives, not just the communications objectives, and how can I fit my communications objectives into the wider business planning. Am I seeking to diversify the business? Am I seeking to attract new talent? Am I keen to hold on to and retain the talent that I've got? Because by taking a temperature check of your business and where you're at, I'll allow you to set those objectives that have got very clear outcomes and goals. And then from that, you can begin to break down into the audiences and the messages and the tactics, and they all flow from each other. And as I mentioned earlier, we've pulled together a template comms plan with a few examples, but then blank space for you to be able to fill in the sections and the 3 steps to messaging, which should really help you and should really simplify the process. And hopefully it'll put you on the right path to building your business and your organisation that you're involved with, and getting that cut through and that razor sharp messaging that you're after. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Sharon. That was thoroughly interesting, really good. And look at that, bang on 40 minutes, and I think you've practiced. Just we've got a bit of time now. If people have got any questions that they want to pop in the chat box, or raise your virtual hand. I've got a couple of questions just to kick off. But just to start with, I'm going to be sharing this template, Jane. Will I be able to send this presentation out to?
Of course, yeah. I'll condense it down because it's quite heavy. But yeah.
Brilliant.
Absolutely.
Appreciate that. Really, really useful. Yeah, just a couple of questions. Should you just have one comms strategy, Jane?
Yeah, I would for your business. I mean, you can break it down and go into more detail. So you might have an overarching comms strategy which lays out your objectives and your audiences, but you might need standalone plan for certain aspects. You might need a PR plan which sits on its own, but it forms part of a communications plan. So your PR activity, if you're going down that PR route and that's really important to you, you might need to break down how you do that in a little bit more detail, and it can sit as a supplementary part of your wider comms plan. You might need to go into things like which particular publications are important to you, who are you seeking to influence, where are those people, you know, how long will it take, set timescales, and there might be, you might need a budget for that as well, for content. It depends how deep you want to delve into it. Again, with a social media plan, you may want to plan to the nth degree as to what you're having going out on each day, on each channel, and campaigns and themes over several weeks or months. And you can dive into it as deep as you want to. I'm conscious that when if you're running a business or you've got an SME and your job's not just marketing, you're wearing lots and lots of different hats, then you can only afford to put a certain amount of time towards PR and comms. So I'd recommend, if you can, keep it simple, but it depends on how deep you want to dive with it, really, that you can go, and you can have a lot of plans sitting under your headline plan.
Thanks. And then I just wanted to ask about how important, you know, in order for a communications plan to be effective, should it be managed by the comms team, the marketing team? Should everybody in the business be aware of what the comms plan is?
Yeah, everybody in the business for me should be aware of what the comms plan is, because just like I've always viewed that everybody in a business is a salesperson, no matter what job they do, because it's their job to advocate that business, just as everybody in that business is in PR. You know, from the person who sits on the front desk in normal times, or the person who drives the van, they're all representing that business. They're all, for me, within PR. So I would always advocate sharing a comms plan with the team, so that everybody knows what page you're on, and then you can all ensure that you're talking with one voice as opposed to cutting across each other.
Just got a question in the chat box. I'm not sure if it's for Jane or Sharon, but you mentioned that a key objective is building trust. How do you measure whether you've built trust? This company's looking at likes, comments, shares, etc. There's something else they should be looking at as a measurement of trust.
Do you want to take this one, Sharon?
Sorry, I was still sharing the screen, so I wasn't sure if you were going to speak then. I think it comes back to those, the measurement of that is probably the reviews. And if you can put yourself on a review site like Trustpilot, and people are commenting and you know, saying good things about you, then I think it's probably measured by return of customer as well, depending what your organisation does. If people are going to come back and use you and pass recommendations on to friends and things, and then that, I think that's a good way of measuring trust. I don't know if Jane's got anything else to.
Yeah, I mean, it's intangible, and it's very hard. How do you measure something which is so intangible? But if you get it right, then you will notice an uplift in the business, in the organisation, in attitudes. You can survey people, you know, again, it goes back to knowing what your starting point is. If you can survey stakeholders or audiences before you start any kind of communications with them, and ask them what their opinions are of your business or your services, and then at a later date you can survey them again, and you can see the uplift or the difference in opinion. That's one way of doing it, and that's not obviously open to everybody, because it takes time and money to do that. But in larger organisations, that's what you see. In smaller organisations, it's often just good to get that word of mouth feedback. Clients often tell me that they've received word of mouth feedback from their clients. You know, oh, we're seeing you all over at the moment, we're seeing you in all these publications, or you're winning lots of awards, or you're everywhere at the moment. And that's the kind of buzz that they're creating, but you can only kind of sometimes measure that and take the temperature on that by asking people and getting that kind of informal feedback on something that's so intangible.
I guess repeat business is a good sign of trust. Absolutely.
If people keep coming to you for more, then that's a sign that the trust is building. If they inquire about new services with you, it's often the case in agencies and consultancies like Counter Context that we get asked to do a particular piece of work, and the trust is built, and then we're brought in to do other aspects of work, and the scope extends and lengthens, and that's a good sign for me that the trust is there. And that's obviously what you're aiming to do, is to get customers spending more with you, and to begin to build that trust, so that they come to you for all manner of things, not just the one thing that they came to you for initially. And for me, that's a really good sign that you're in safe hands if customers are asking you to do more for them.
Are there any final questions before we wrap up, anybody want to raise their hand or fire in a last question to the chat box? So if not, I just encourage everybody to make a note of the contact details for Counter Context if they want to pick up with Jane and Sharon at a later date. I'll pick up on anything further. As Jane mentioned, I will send a follow-up email later today, which will include the slides, the template for you to use, and as mentioned earlier, the recording of today's session will be on our YouTube channel within the next day or two. So yeah, I mean, Jane, Sharon, did you have anything to add before we wrap up?
No, just track us down on LinkedIn, on social media, and get in touch if we can support you in any way. I'm more than happy to offer advice if anybody's got any questions that come to them suddenly in the rest of the day. But check us out, check out what Counter Context are doing, because there's some absolutely incredible work going on right through the UK that we're right at the heart of, and it'd be good to be able to share that with you. So yeah, please try and track us down on LinkedIn.
Well, I hope you'll all join me in thanking Jane and Sharon. It was really, really useful and interesting session this morning. So thank you both. Really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for joining us. Plenty of further chamber events coming up if you just head to the events calendar on the chamber's website, and look forward to seeing you all again.